Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sandy Bartolfinocci, and I am the Chief Math Officer with Carnegie Learning, and I'm going to be moderating our conversation today. Thanks. For those that may be joining us for the second time, just to let you know, this is actually event number 2 in a small series that we've had. The first time we got together was with MDTP and Carnegie Learning, and we were thinking about during that first call where we were setting the stage, kind of giving an overview of what MDTP diagnostic assessment was, how it can be used to shape your instruction. We talked a little bit about Carnegie Learning's Mathia and Live Lab as a way to use an instructional resource to help guide your work as you're re-entering the schools. For today's call, what we're going to do is go just a little bit deeper, and we're going to think about a particular topic as students are getting ready to come into the middle grades, in 6th grade in particular. And we really want to be thinking about how we can do the right thing at the right time to help ensure our students' success and get them ready to learn. So today, joining with me on the panel, first and foremost is going to be our MDTP guest, Kim Samiago, who is the statewide director for the USC-UC Math Diagnostic Testing Project. And also joining us today is going to be Sarah Galasso, who is our lead math solution specialist here at Carnegie Learning. And I've had the pleasure of working with both of these ladies over the last year to learn a lot about the MDT assessment. And then Sarah's doing a ton of work around thinking about that assessment and how it applies to on grade level and how we can truly help our students be successful. So before I kind of go any further though, we're going to jump right in here in just a quick second. I want to remind you and kind of set the stage for where we are, just in essence, to think about this. Colette, will you hit the slide, please? Thanks. That our ultimate goal as educators truly is one about building a community of learners. And we don't want to ever forget that, no matter where we are, if it's COVID, if it's distance learning, whatever that is, that's kind of our general goal as educators. And so as we are thinking about our re-entry into next year, we recognize that this is a little different than it's ever been before, but we want to make sure that we maintain some of the true basics of what we were thinking about. So as we were talking, we want to just say first and foremost, we definitely recommend that you jump right into your on grade level content next year. That's, we want to respect our kids. We want to get in and we want to help. Again, why we're talking to you today is help provide you with tools to make smart decisions along the way. So that's first and foremost. The second is, I just want to remind everybody just a little bit that I was doing some reading current research, reading past research. And it always, just continue reminding ourselves that a teacher's perception of student readiness to learn has a significant impact on their mathematics achievement. So no matter what where you think the students are coming from, just keep reminding yourself that you are their most important ingredient and they are not there yet. So without kind of further ado, I'm going to be passing the ball over to Kim real shortly. But we have what I tried to do is set together like this plan, like a protocol, if you will, a template, so that kind of drive the conversations that we're going to be having today. So I'm going to turn this over to Kim, and she's going to take, when we think about planning, we think about how are we gathering data, how do we analyze, interpret it, how do we develop and set goals, and then how are we going to implement and then revisit those goals over time. So my first question to Kim, as she kicks it off to the first 2 buckets here of gathering data and then analyzing and interpreting it. Well, first and foremost is going to be question number 1 is I want Kim to answer for us. When do you think students should be given this MDTP assessment? And then in order to kind of go a little bit deeper, what we decided when we were talking, and quite honestly, when I'm out in schools all over the place, and I talk to middle grade teachers, and I ask them that question, kind of what's the big critical idea, fraction operations inevitably comes first. And interestingly enough, that came right up in our chat message, this notion of fraction operation and number sense. So what we thought we would do is take a look at some of the 6th grade assessment items that have to do with fractions, and in particular multiplying fractions. So Kim is going to talk to us about those items and the data that we gain. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to talk about when and how can I be thinking about differentiating our instruction. So Kim, welcome.
Thank you.
First question, when do I give it? And then give us a lot of great information about the MDTP diagnostic.
Okay. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Kim Samaniego. I'm the director of the MDTP project. We are a grant-funded project from the CSU UC systems in California. We're actually funded to support all secondary math educators in California for free. So everything that we offer are free. And so I'll talk a little bit about the diagnostic test, and then I'll answer Sandy's question. So first of all, thank you. We design diagnostic tests that are especially illuminate student thinking. That's the whole goal here, is to give you an assessment, to do the thing, to show you a student thinking, so that you don't have to write those assessments yourselves. We want to know, how are students ready? What is their readiness around prerequisite skills? So how the information they come in with, and then how does that inform their access to your current course and also subsequent courses. So MDT diagnostics are designed to do a few things. Specifically, if you look at the item level, they're designed to illuminate the strengths, the unfinished learning, and the gaps in content. So Sandy said, when do we give that test? My answer to you is that the MDTP diagnostic test can be given anytime during the year. Specifically, if you're looking to learn something about what your students know, to help inform where you're going to go. So a really good time that we think, as MDTP designs these tests, is when you first get the students in the fall. It is a good idea to understand their prerequisite knowledge. Now, it doesn't mean that the first day that you see students, you should give them a test. And particularly now with distance learning and remote environments, I think it's important to really build an environment of trust, some collaborative events to get students to understand what the purpose of an assessment would be first. So you need to have some community building. You need to establish some norms of a classroom. And also you need students to, the most important thing is, do students know why they're being assessed and any assessment? So if the students have an understanding that you're going to be using MDTP formatively, and they understand that it's going to help you design instruction to support their access to your content. Once that has been established, then you're ready to take the MDTP test. So after the first week, if you're doing, community building, anytime within the first month is a good time to take the test initially. So that's the answer, Sandy, to your question, first of all. So now I'm going to get into how do the diagnostic results actually provide several levels of formative value. And this is to answer the question about student readiness. So go ahead and click. The first level is that we can look at readiness around around the class. So we can say, how is the class doing in overall foundational topics? Click. So this informs our very first steps in our course planning and unit planning. So how are students doing in decimals? How are students doing in fractions and integers? We can look at it this way. Once we've looked at overall class readiness and kind of understanding what that means, we can look at each item in a topic, and that can help us look at how are the students doing in terms of their strengths, their unfinished learning, and gaps. And this is really helpful for us when we're planning units, but also in upcoming lessons. So this is going to tell us what support a student might need to access the content for that current lesson. Okay, and then the next thing we can look at is individually, how are students doing? What do they know? And this is going to help us to identify whether we can do whole class instruction, well, what type of whole class, and also if we could provide differentiated learning experiences. So not all students might need the same intervention. So let's look at that first level, which is class readiness. This is a topical analysis from the 6th grade assessment of preparedness given to 38 students entering into the fall. This particular view will show you that the 6th grade assessment has 6 topics that the items are categorized into. And each topic has an item count and then a critical level. So critical levels are where MDTP has determined that students should have the number correct in order to be adequately prepared for the content in your course in that topic. So, and for example, student who gets 3 out of 5 items correct in decimals would be ready for the content in 6th grade around decimals. That's their level of readiness. The next thing that we're going to do, because Sandy had talked to us about, if we look at all of this data, the whole chart, it's a lot. It's actually too much to really bring into our daily teaching, right? And at times it gets overwhelming. So we look at it, but then we forget about it because it's too much. So rather than looking at everything at once, let's talk about a topic. For example, let's talk about multiplying fractions. So if we look at the topic of fractions, we can look and see that there are 34% of the students in my class readiness, are emerging in their readiness around fractions, right? It's not their strongest topic, and it's definitely something that they're just developing knowledge in. And I want to always bring in this idea that readiness is emerging. It's always malleable and it's always changing. Doesn't mean that if a student isn't ready for the content that they shouldn't be in your course. What it means is that we need to understand their readiness to help support them access your content. That's what it means. Okay, the next slide will take us into looking at the items in the topic. So we chose fractions, and these are the 8 items in that topic. And so if you click on the first, click for me, 1 click, you'll notice that we're going to look at 2 items that are about multiplying fractions. So item 11, students did well on item 11. 84% got this item correct. So this would be a strength for students. And it's something we should look at to build on, right? Item 30 is another item that is also talking about multiplying fractions. As you can see, students are more challenged by this item and are going to probably need a little bit more support, or this item is an emerging topic for them. Okay, so let's look at some of those items specifically. So this is item 11, it means question 11, and the item says 5 times 3/4. So what we need to do in looking at an item is like, okay, so what does it mean? What does the data tell us? So we're going to see how does it help us inform their strengths, unfinished learning, and their gaps. Click. So in doing that, a strength, we need to understand what strengths mean. So a strength is when items, most of the students answer that item correctly. We don't want to just say this is a strength and move on. We want to say this is a strength and build on it. This means that we don't have to think about, I'm going to say it like this because it's reteaching. We don't want to think about reteaching. We want to think about the fact that students come in with this knowledge and we can build on it. So this would be a strength. Okay, the next thing is to think about is unfinished learning. I categorize unfinished learning in 2 ways, and one of them's tricky, one of them makes sense. Misconception. This is an item where a lot of students, you can hit 1 more click. There you go. Items that a large percent of the students chose, but it's incorrect. So the students have a way of thinking about how to answer this that has formulated probably some really strong neural pathways to thinking that this is the right way to do it. And what we need to do is we need to intervene, re-engage and intervene, and be able to relearn and bridge to new learning, right? So this is something that a misconception can show us that we need to actually intervene. Guessing, it looks like students are guessing because their choices are kind of randomly chosen. They're not necessarily guessing though. It's not that they don't have learning. What's happening here is that a lot of times students get a lot of procedural knowledge. They look at a lot of procedures and say, I've seen this before, but they have unfinished learning. They don't quite know what to do with it. So they'll see something in a distractor that says, oh, that makes sense. That resonates with me, but it's unfinished. So it's not actually bridging to the right content. So they're not truly guessing. Some might be, but they may not be. They're just not quite finished and they're learning on that. So we do need to intervene. And then the last way is gaps. So in MDTP world, we ask students, and this is another thing about building community and answering Sandy's question, when do I give this test? On the MDTP, we ask students not to guess if they don't know, because that is also data. If they're guessing, it could skew our results. But if students purposely omit a question, and they're omitted at a high rate, that's going to tell you this students probably don't have enough learning, unfinished learning, to actually work through this problem. So this could be considered the gap. I saw one of the chat questions was, what are the students not doing at the last chapter? Like, how do I know this? These could be indicators, items that are gaps, could be indicating something that students may not have learned yet. Okay. All right, let's go back to that item that we first looked at. So when the students take the item on our online platform, it gives you a few things to look at. So give me a first click here. So first we want to look at omitted. Not a large amount, 3% of 38 students omitted this. So that means that most of the students felt adequately confident in answering this question. So this is not a gap for students, right? Then click again. Then we notice that 84% of the students answered this correctly. So this, for a class in general, as a class, this is a strength for students, this concept, right? This actual multiplying these two numbers together is a strength. We should build on that. And then we look again, one more click, at 13% though had a common misconception. So what we want to do, one more click, is we want to know, what does this response show you about what students know? Right? Because if they're choosing this, they know math. They know something to choose that 15 over 20 makes sense to them. So this is a misconception that maybe with the 13% we can think about in how we're going to strategize with the intervention for 13. Okay, so what I'm going to summarize there is that we looked at gaps, misconceptions, and unfinished learning. So in this particular problem, this is a whole different problem. This is problem 30. As you know, they were more challenged with this problem. So what I'm going to ask you is to think about a couple clicks. So 3 clicks here, right? Omitted, correct, and then 22%. So one more click here. What I like to do is give you about 30 seconds to answer in the chat, how would you classify this item? So 30 seconds, Sandy, I did that right, 30 seconds. Okay. Units matter. That's right. Last time I said 30 minutes. So in the chat, how would you classify this item?
So you're asking him if it's a strength, a misconception, or a gap, correct?
That's correct. It doesn't have to be one or the other, too. It could be a multiple, it could be both, right? It could be many things, 3 things. Well, it's a strength for some, right? And others, okay. Great, I'm seeing some answers popping up. This is fantastic. Okay, so one more click here. So I'd like you now to spend about 60 seconds, so 1 minute, and I want you to think about at least what you've considered. Let's go first to the first thing. So 14%, I saw some of you said this is a gap. 14% of the students chose not to answer this question. Now this is item 30 and out of a 35 item test. So it could be that they were towards the end, but they're also showing you by not answering, it was only 6% didn't see it. That means they didn't finish the test. So it's a total different 6%. So for those 14%, they didn't feel they had the content knowledge to be able to answer this problem. So those of you who said this is a gap, yes, for those 14%, this would probably be a gap for those students, correct? And then for 44% of the students, this is a strength for them. This is something that they already have good access of the content, right? But 22% have a misconception. So this is kind of one of those items that tells you a lot of information about different students, so we'd want to drill in and figure that out. Okay, now I want to give about 60 seconds for you to answer in the chat. If you can, let's just look at answer B, the misconception. What does this response tell you about what students know? So in order for them to answer B, what do students know about this problem? And I won't talk for 60 seconds. So Sandy, moderator, tell me when that is.
Okay.
Hi, Ivan.
Getting some great responses.
Absolutely.
This is actually, while they're doing that, this is some of the power behind looking at the data, right? It's just unpacking it to understand and having conversations and changing the way you think about things. And I always learn something every time we look at the data. You just see it a little bit differently each time and how it applies.
Great. Great responses. Thank you. I'm reading them as they pop up, so thank you. So as we can see, if students are selecting B, they know a lot about math already. They come to us, and this is one of the things that we have to really appreciate about our students. While they may have had some challenges in remote learning this year, they're still coming to us with a lot of mathematics, and we need to capitalize on what they know. So when we're looking at data, we want to look at what do students know and how does that help me drive forward. So that's where I get to pass off now, and then we'll change the speakers. So thank you, Sandy.
All right, so thanks, Kim. Like a couple things that resonate with me when we think about, Kim gave you some great advice there about when to give the MDTP. I added on to this notion of giving them enough time to finish. I know that in the past, Kim and you and I have talked about maybe this is a 2-day event to give this assessment, but you really want to gain that information from kids to make sure they have time to do this work. And then I think it was also really important when you're analyzing and interpreting the data, this notion of how it's drilling down into these multiple levels of formative value. I would also like to point out one more thing that I always appreciate when speaking with you in particular is the positive tone in which you relay your information. And I want to pause for a quick second just to highlight that. You use words like it's emergent, that how to re-engage, how are we helping kids relearn? And the most important one is, what do students know? And how do we keep accentuating on what they know? And what they don't know yet is our job. Let's get them ready. Let's do that kind of work. So it's also a good way to bridge to Sarah and to take the next part of when we think about planning. One is kind of the questions that, Sarah, it's for you to address now, is thinking about fractions, thinking about 6th grade, multiplying fractions. How does data like this impact a topic plan? Kind of when and how should we be addressing this issue? Sarah.
So thinking about fraction operation items and everything that Kim showed us and that Sandy said and what we know about those fractions and the impact they have, let's take a moment and take a look at the big picture. Here we have our course 1 or 6th grade scope and sequence. Depending on your materials, this may look a little bit different, but the same ideas hold true, that you want to address this content just in time. It's easy to fall into the trap of, I need to address it at the beginning of the year or right off the bat, but we really want to do this just in time for when students need it. For us in our scope and sequence, that comes within the second topic of our first module, where we look at positive rational numbers. And as we look at the standards addressed within that topic, we can see an identified connection. So Colette, if you go ahead and just click, thank you. And as we look at those understandings of multiplying a whole number by a fraction, interpreting an area model, the procedural and conceptual aspects of multiplying fractions, which are assessing 5NF4, we know that the work students are doing in 6th grade around 6NS1, dividing fractions by fractions, is really that critical moment. And as we look at this coherence map, we can see that the lessons addressing that 6NS1 standard are all linked back to those 5th grade standards. So this is the right moment to make some instructional decisions based on the data we have and to implement those decisions. And so now getting to your question, Sandy, of the how do we do this? What does this look like? We have to start with that same idea of a strength. If this is a strength for our students, then we need to make some intentional decisions around that. If this is most of our students, like that first problem, item 11 that Kim showed us, then I'm going to look at reducing the scaffolding around the actual multiplication, the procedural aspect of multiplying those fractions, and then look to see if there's some stretch or extension activities that I can add for my students. If it's unfinished learning, or if it's a misconception, that guessing situation that Kim talked about, we want to think about it just a little bit differently. Because when we have that unfinished learning or misconception moment, we actually have two different scenarios. And if we can click to the next slide, we have most students and we have some students. If I'm dealing with most of my students, meaning more than 60%, maybe even more than that, I might want some short collaborative opportunities for students to address those misconceptions. If I have a small amount of my students, let's say it's more like that 22%, then I'm going to be thinking about small group instruction. In either case, whether it's most of the students or some of the students still need an individual opportunity to develop mastery, all right? It's not just I addressed it once and then that's the end of it. We need that ongoing individual opportunity. And the last case option as we look at is the gap. What if this was a gap for my students? Like we saw when those students omitted an answer. Again, it's two different situations. If it's the vast majority of my students, if it's most of my students, then I want to have some type of mini lesson that I'm using within the structure of my day that's going to address the conceptual understanding. And when we looked at that item 30, that was really addressing conceptually, how do we multiply two fractions, right? They can understand the procedure, but what's the concept behind it to make that model? I still want to do some small group instruction beyond that. We addressed it as a whole class in a mini lesson, but now let me target some small groups and refine things and still have that opportunity for individuals to develop mastery. If it's just some of my students, then let me dig in again with some small group instruction. Make sure in those small groups, I'm supporting both conceptual understanding and procedural understanding. And again, I want to have opportunities for individuals to develop mastery as we go along. So what does this look like in the context of a lesson? Sometimes you'll see a worked example that might look like this. If it's a strength, I know I don't need to spend a lot of time there. But if it's a misconception or a gap, this is something that's happening in the moment of a 6th grade lesson, my core content lesson, that I can dive deeper and ask some questions and have students respond to those questions to clarify those misconceptions. I can ask things like, could I set the model up differently to show 1/4 on the horizontal line and 1/2 on the vertical line? Does it matter which fraction is placed where? Or how do you use the shading to interpret your answer? And what does that mean as you look at the model? And getting kids to uncover those misconceptions that they had based on the way that they answered the item. Another thing that you can do as you look at the context is to give students the opportunity to have some peer analysis, right? In our book, we do a thumbs up or a thumbs down to take a look at that. And what you're going to see on the next slide is a couple of examples that are showing students different ways to look at the problem procedurally. We've addressed it conceptually, we have an idea, we can have some conversations. But now as we look procedurally, what are some different ways that they can think about multiplying these quantities together? And how can we apply these same structures and strategies that they've learned before? Kim, you talked about how they do know something, right? So how do we tap into that and build up? And these are all great ways to engage students in discourse and to get the collaborative learning happening, but we can't forget about the individual mastery. And so as we look at a tool like we have Mathia, we see examples where we're having students continue to build on their conceptual understanding, getting some instruction or some ideas around how multiplying by a fraction is going to affect different numbers, and then opportunities to continue to develop that understanding as they think about different fractions and different quantities and what's going to happen. Or as they continue seeing those fraction models, as we see on the next slide, where students continue to look at those fraction models and work with them to build their understanding around how do I multiply fractions together. But ultimately, what we want to see as we can see on this next slide where we see 4 examples, is we want to see that students are doing this within the context of their lesson and their work. We're not stopping to do this. We're continuing to do this because we know that fluency with division is really about the ability to fluidly move back and forth between multiplication and division and understand those relationships so that they're able to rewrite numerical expressions or algebraic expressions and continue to fluidly move back and forth. So even in the context of the work they're doing around dividing fractions, I still want to give them those opportunities to multiply a whole number times a fraction or a fraction times a fraction. And this is really critical as we think about it, because if we go back to shaping that instruction and thinking about how we do this and those flow charts that we had, you'll notice at the end of each one of them, as you see in this next screen, it always had individual opportunities for mastery, right? And that's key. We have to continue, whether it's within the context of the grade level work we're doing or continued small groups, we have to have those continued opportunities for students to master the content as an individual. And so as we think about that planning, that's how we shape our instruction, and we work with our students in order to continue to address their strengths, their misconceptions, and those gaps.
Yep. So kind of, you know, this is a great partnership because one, the diagnostic information that we're getting from MDTP, very thoughtful, very well thought out, but you know that as Kim was talking about, she was talking about topics and prerequisites to different standards. So then the real work becomes, then how do you understand what your scope and sequence is? And then where do you want to address this unfinished learning? You've heard both Kim and Sarah talk about, let's not front load, let's get smart about thinking about doing this at the, doing the right thing at the right time. Collect the next slide, please. So as we kind of go back and think about that, putting this all together, like Sarah just talked about, how do we consider the big plan? And then the last element really is about how we helping them monitor what's going on as well. Because just because you've given this, you know, kind of as Kim mentioned earlier, just because you gave this diagnostic up front, you want to keep going back to it. Kids are learning new concepts, and there are some kids that you might teach a new concept in 6th grade, something's going to click. So, you know, there's an opportunity to continue to monitor. So this was just a plan of thinking. We put this together just to give you some high-level questions that you can be asking yourself as you are teaching either 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. So how are we collecting this data, analyzing it? There are lots of tools. We have tools to analyze our own content, professional development. There are coherence maps that are built. I strongly suggest getting together with your peers, having these kinds of conversations and thinking about how are we going to start the year? What are the things that we're going to do in the first 9 weeks? Let's not try to chew the whole elephant in one bite. Understand what that is, and then get ready to, you know, once we give the diagnostic and we know more about what students know coming in, then we can start making adjustments along the way. So I would like to, if you go one more, Colette, we want to open it up for a little bit of Q&A. And the first question that I see peppered to me, Kim, I'm going to direct this to you. How would a teacher go about implementing MDTP if we are starting remotely in the fall?
That's a good question. We've actually created a use agreement for remote testing with some guidelines. So you would contact your site director. So UC MDTP has 4 sites at the UC and 4 sites at CSU. So contact MDTP at ucsd.edu. You can email us, or you can look at our website. Just put a dot instead of the at, and you can find out who your site directors are, and then you can request online testing. In the guidelines that we have, we suggest things like try to do some remote proctorings, try to build collaborative, a way of instilling a need and a purpose, and some testing behaviors, which are also, we do provide a student video that the students will see first when they come in that has the appropriate student behaviors. You know, clear your workspace, don't use a calculator, don't use other equipment, you know, copyright, what it means to uphold a copyright. So we understand though that this is also challenging to give remote testing. educators need to understand that their students' access is basically dictated by their internet and their computer. So sometimes not all students are going to have the speed that other students have, or going to have the a computer that will load their problems. It is a web-based problem, but just understanding that there's some patience that has to be involved when giving it, but it is open remotely. A logistics thing to consider is that it's only available, the online platform is only available from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. for testing. Any day. So this was done before, of course, when they were meant to be proctored in person, because we didn't want students to get into the environment without a proctored teacher to come back and enter into their assessments. But we're doing whatever we can to support you right now. We have some helpful resources. Just go ahead and contact us and we'll get you set up.
Okay. All right. Are there, let's see. I have another question that came up. That's, I guess it's more of a, not, so I'm going to ask it because someone answered it. We have a couple minutes. But as we think about social distancing, and we're trying to identify, you know, Sarah, I'm going to toss this one to you, Sarah. Ready?
Let's go.
Some of the things that you talked about there were, you know, individual activities or small group activities or whole group activities. How are we going to get kids, you know, if you don't have an answer right now, you know, these are things that we're thinking about. This social distancing, how are you going to get kind of that idea of kids working together? That's not necessarily a softball, because there's a wide variety of how to get better at remote learning, but anything off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it's the reason this isn't the easiest question to answer is because there's so many different variables and so many different things that can happen.
Yep.
When I think about remote learning and being in a virtual environment, if it's synchronous class time and you have the ability to use breakout rooms, pulling breakout rooms and popping into one with a group of students is a great way to establish that same small group setting and conversation. And having students move back and forth between breakout rooms. If you are doing more asynchronous, then setting up times to meet with students in small groups of students so that you're all meeting at the same time and you have some synchronous moments to do that small group work is another great way to do it. As more and more schools are looking at the reality of the face-to-face classroom and how that's going to change. I think, you know, as I imagine it, and if I were to go back, it'd be less about paper pencil and more about non-permanent writing surfaces. So how am I using more whiteboards so that students can write bigger and see things across the room? Or how am I using more vertical space? Just so students can still see what's going on even when they're 6 feet away from another student. So thinking about, you know, the idea, it was interesting how a lot of students I work with, when they write something on paper, they think it's permanent. But when they write it on a whiteboard, they think it's non-permanent. So just thinking about those spaces that allow for more, like more writing to happen or more print or more things to happen, and really communicating with each other in a structured way. Those are, I mean, off the top of my head, those are a few things I'd love to dive deeper with anybody that wants to and learn more about their specific space and just brainstorm with everybody. That'd be great.
I think the critical thing that you said here, that everyone needs to keep in mind. It's not about, you know, necessarily like how many in the group. It's how we getting that discourse to continue. That's the important thing. It's not anymore. The vehicle can change, but how do we get that level of ability up for our students that we're asking them, you know, one or two big questions that they're responding to is, you know, think and choose wisely again about what your content is and how are we continuing that discourse. Because it's also really easy to slide back into in a remote learning that it's skill, procedure. And when you look at the two items that you presented, Kim, one is kind of, you know, procedural, and the other was interpreting a conceptual understanding. And, you know, those are both very, very important along the way. So no matter how we might not have answers to all those questions. And again, Sarah's offering, I'd take you up on it. If I were you out there, Mr. and Mrs. Teacher, have a conversation around how to make this work in your classrooms. But Kim, I have one more for you. And that question is this: is the language on the MDTP in line with the language found on the, and I'm sorry, I don't know the acronym, so I'm gonna rattle
Yeah,
off.
I can read I'll read the problem. I got this.
Okay. All right.
All right, so this is a good question. Just so a little bit more knowledge about how the MDTP test is written, we look at the progressions of mathematics, and we look at what student learnings, what students have learned in their prerequisite before coming to a course. And we think about what are the most important things that students need to know to access the content for a particular course. So each MDTP diagnostic test is written for a specific course or grade level. So when we're thinking about writing these items, we're not thinking about assessing the work in that current grade level. So so we're not, it's not a practice test for a CASP, which is the Smarter Balance assessment at the end of the year, because the CASP assessment is looking to see how students, it's a summative assessment of what have students learned after they've taken this class. MDTP tells you what do students know when they get to you, so that you can make your appropriate instructional adjustments if needed, or you can give enrichments as needed based on the data. So it's informing. So it's MDTP is a formative assessment. The wording would not be the same as CASP because it's not for the same purpose. So the word we design our items to illuminate what students are thinking. Each distractor gives you something into about students are thinking about a particular problem, so that you can use that student thinking to do what Sarah's suggests, which is whole group instruction, small group differentiated learning, re-engagement, how you introduce the content again with more questioning, with the scaffolds or no scaffolds. That's what you learn from an MDTP test. It's helping you bridge the content. Right. So but it's not to say that it's not a good preparation for what students know about math. And so maybe if you wanted to give it before the CASP assessment to see how your students are acquiring content, you could give the next level readiness test to see how they're doing in that new content. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So you could use it, but it still would be formative.
Right. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. We're about a minute to go here, and I just wanted to do a little, thank you to both of you for preparing and bringing your wisdom to the group. I know I always enjoy having conversations with you guys. There's always a lot to learn. As we think about the math, a couple things, mathematics is a connected web, right? There's this arc of the mathematics that goes all the way across, and the more we have conversations about it, the more we can understand what that arc and what those connections are and how we can make those connections. Then using a diagnostic tool like MDTP helps us just know more about our students, respecting them, and then putting that on us as educators to get it in the right place at the right time. So I know that we will be sending out a recording of this email or of this webinar afterwards. If anybody out there has any questions, feel free to let us.
Questions real quick. I see real quick. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
First, MDTP is free to California educators. Everything that we have is free. The second is we do have an assessment of preparedness for 8th grade. So we start in 6th grade and we go through calculus. So one for each grade level from 6th grade through 7th and 8th, and then each course, which are the high school courses for the integrated and traditional pathways through calculus. So that's a quick answer to those 2 questions that popped up.
Great. I missed those. Are there any others?
Oh, I did answer that one, I think. The form, how do they give it in distance learning model?
Yeah.
So I think the question is how, whether then it's available. One example is to try to create proctored Zoom sessions for smaller groups, not maybe all 30 students, maybe you do 10 students at a time. And then you're giving the students, that you can proctor it, watch them, help them, assist them if they have questions. Other than that, I mean, you've got to be creative, and we're just trying to figure this out. We get, maybe after this this spring, we'll gather some information from some of the educators to figure out how they did it, how they implemented it, because we've been letting the remote testing happen since March. So we can be collecting some data on that.
I would imagine, you know, if the more you communicate, again, like we said before, like the more you let students know why they're giving this test.
That's right.
Also the thing at the end, make sure that even when you've given this assessment and you're doing extra work with them or whatever that is, to keep, it's about the student. How do you keep them informed all the time about where they are in this learning process and how we're here to help you? And maybe a parent letter home would be not a bad idea, like explaining to the parents if that's the case as well, keeping that community between you as the school, the teacher, your class, and then what's going on at home. The more we keep them connected, the more everybody understands why we do what we do.
That's right. And also that last part of that first question was, how can we ensure we're gathering valid data?
Right.
That actually goes back to the community building and what the students understanding the purpose of the test. So if the students understand that this test is to help them access the content by giving you information, they're going to be very cognizant about giving you accurate data. They're gonna say, I want you to know this about me, and they're gonna purposely omit things because they're gonna say, I need help with this. I know I don't know this, or you know, they're a lot more. They're gonna take it much more time with it. Also, as Sandy had said, give them time to finish. Maybe break it out over a couple days, which can be done on the online platforms.
Well, again, thank you, ladies, for joining us. Thank you in the audience for joining our Zoom today to listen to us chat. Again, if you need any help or you have any questions, feel free. We're here for you to help you help kids. Thanks.
Thank you.